Let's begin with a little E.E. Cummings. In just spring. In just spring, when the world is bud luscious, the little lame balloon man whistles far and wee, and Eddie and Bill come running from marbles and piracies, and it's spring, when the world is puddle wonderful. The queer old balloon man whistles far and wee, and Betty and Isabel come dancing from hopscotch and jump rope, and it's spring, and the goat-footed balloon man whistles far and wee. Good morning. I'm Richard Schramm. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the North Universalist Chapel Society and the service coordinator, your guide to today's service. Welcome to this caring, sharing community on this rather gray Sunday, April 30th. Whoever you are, we welcome you. Wherever you come from, we welcome you. Whomever you love, we welcome you. Welcome to the North Chapel, where we aspire to be a congregation that nurtures the growth and supports the needs of its members, sustains a strong spiritual life within a loving church community, and seeks to have a positive impact on the world around us. A special welcome to those who are visiting. If you're visiting and you'd like, can you tell us your name and where you're from? Okay. And if you're still a visitor, we'd invite you to sign the guest book at the back of the sanctuary. Please turn off your cell phones, which reminds me I haven't done that. Let's see how to do this. Okay. There's something about airplane mode. I never figured that one out. Oops. I got a text from Polly Fortier. Excuse me while I answer it. And Monica's here to be with the children, and that's wonderful. We have a lot of announcements. I'm going to begin with Chloe, who had some words to say.
Hey everyone, it's nice to be back. So I now am at the Chandler, but actually one of the first events that I'm programming is going to be here in Woodstock. It's a Chandler at Large production, and friends of mine who are Ukrainian artists who met in Kiev in 2014 during the protests. She is a Ukrainian ethnomusicologist and specialist in Ukrainian folk music, and they live in Toronto now, and they fuse traditional folk music and electronic modern sound. And they're called Balaklava Blues, and we're hosting a benefit concert. We have support from a grant I wrote pre-pandemic to support world music in Woodstock. They're going to be going to the Woodstock 7th grade in the afternoon and speak to the whole 7th grade. And beforehand, the Change the World kids are hosting a fundraiser dinner here at 6 o'clock. And if you want to come early at 5:30, we'll have a talk with the artists. So it's a really great experience, and with support also from Imagine Zero Festival, which y'all should go to, we are able to cover the artist fees. So after the production costs, it's a pure fundraiser for a cause that the band identified. So please come out. We'd love to see you. Good to be back. Thank you.
Barbara?
Hi, I'm Barbara Abraham, and I led the Cakes for the Queen of Heaven curriculum. We ended about a month ago, and we decided we wanted to get together once a month on Sundays at 4 o'clock, and it just happens that next Sunday at 4 is our next gathering. So a women's circle, please see me or Deb Rice, as we will be co-leading that group. So all women are welcome. Okay. Oh, and goddess attire, if you so desire. And I do. So. Thank you.
Okay.
morning. Farmer, miller, innkeeper, priest, doctor, mother, judge, and deceased. Men and women from Woodstock's first 100 years tell their story. It's based on this book. It's an event that's going to be here. We'll be entertained, we'll learn about history, and raise some money for North Chapel. We could use some help promoting this event. We've got a bunch of posters, the artwork and printing donated, but I'd love to have these lovely posters get around to some of the surrounding towns. So I'm going to be in the back of the sanctuary after the service with a bunch of these posters and a sign-up sheet. And if you thought, hey, there's a good town hall or a library or someplace in my town to put this up, and you'd like to take one or two, I'd love to have them go out in your hands. We're about at the right amount of time away, a little over 4 weeks to begin to promote it. Thanks.
Another announcement is we have a new railing here over on the side. Yay. I want to thank Peg Brightman for bringing that issue up, and Gina Oriama and the Buildings and Grounds, I guess, to make it happen. So if you have any trouble with mobility, there's a railing over here for your use. Any other announcements? Leon is away, but we're delighted to have Tom Powers, a wonderful historian and friendly neighbor in Vermont, here today to provide a reflection on everybody knows Sacagawea, but I know that's not the right way to say it. When he comes up to talk, he'll tell you how to pronounce it. Meanwhile, I just sort of limp along with this one. Information about Tom and his reflection is in the order of service. Regeneration is our theme for our services in April. Regeneration, rebirth, new beginnings, sort of reclaiming and re-embracing life. I can't really talk about regeneration or rebirth for Sacagawea, although Tom Powers felt the theme fit well with her life and the story of the survival of Native Americans. I can, however, talk a little about a rebirth experience I had and how I was able to move through the experience and eventually re-embrace life as kind of a different person. This experience of rebirth occurred after the death of my wife, Nancy Nye, in 2006. I've talked of this experience often. It's clear I need to work it out. Of the many factors that enter a process of regeneration or rebirth, I want this time to focus on the role of the North Chapel community played in helping me through this time, which began during Nancy's illness and continued several years after she died. So I'm really going to focus on the role of the community in holding someone who is going through this kind of a time in their lives. Of the many factors that enter a process of regeneration, I guess I've said that already. See, you can see I'm still reliving this experience here. Nancy and I have been married 25 years. The pattern of our lives together were well established. Our daily lives, who cooks, who cleans up, who does the recycling, the laundry, pays the bills, that sort of thing. Our shared and separate work lives. What were we working on? Struggles we're facing, support we needed, who's going where and when, and for how long. Our personal lives, handling disagreements, celebrating close moments, being vulnerable. Those are all sort of locked in place in a relationship. They're not totally locked, but they vary, but they're very much part of who you are. Most of you know exactly what I mean here. All of a sudden, upon her death, all of those ways of being together disappeared. It was as if we were wired together, and those wires were abruptly cut and were hanging loosely by my side. I felt like I was adrift in a boat without oars. I was adrift. Who was I without Nancy? For a long time, I floated around, unsure whether I wanted to live or die. Not shoot myself, but die in the sense of not living fully, just getting along, a passive, low-energy kind of place. I really had no appetite for reinventing myself. This church loved me through a grieving process and back into embracing life. I seldom came to the North Chapel until Nancy, diagnosed with cancer in 2004, asked me to join her, something I did every Sunday thereafter. Once the church learned of her condition, folks in the congregation showered us with support of all kinds. I was loved up, even though the church didn't know me. I was loved up just as much as well as Nancy. After her death in late 2006, her daughter Hope and I, in a joint joy and concern, listed the myriad of ways we were supported over the period of her illness. There was food, gardening, wood stacking, cards, visits, books, music, childcare, and toys for forests, just to name a few. There were also some special, more collective gifts of support. Darcy Riccio and many members of the church created a quilt with 99 messages of love and support. Ann Dean led a Star Island healing ceremony with many from the North Chapel. And Diane and the choir came to our house to sing to Nancy. All lovely collective events. Let me show you the quilt. Every one of these little boxes has a message. If you'd like to see it, you come up after. I'll just hang it up here. This love and extraordinary support continued after Nancy's death in different ways. Besides individuals continuing the food, books, gardening, and the like, church activities like covenant groups where people can open up with others and be vulnerable in a safe place provided me opportunities to work through some of my struggles and to gain many close friendships. It was those North Chapel friends who helped me truly re-embrace life and finally to find my wonderful life partner, Peg Brightman. And that's another story of regeneration and new beginnings. I can't imagine how this process would have fared and how I would have fared without the North Chapel. I go back and I think, what if I had not been a part of this community? Where would I have gotten that kind of support and love? After so many years, this story is both a story of regeneration and a good opportunity to express deeply felt thanks to this community and to those close friends who helped me so much. I'd like to invite Laura Foley up to read a poem.
Hi, so last summer we were lucky enough to spend some time up at Lake Huron, and we stayed in a park called Cape Croker Park. The actual name is Nea Shinig Minging, which is the Ojibwe word, and I started to become interested in the language of Ojibwe. I apologize for my pronunciation. Nea Shinig Minging Ringing, Cape Croker Park. Nea Shinig Minging, spoken like bells, ringing for the grace of the point's light, and cormorants diving. Chapawe, Ojibwe, the originals of splashing water, echoes of laughter have been the wind, clear, saltless seas on the lake, and unseeded First Nations cape that played on the ancient limestone bluffs, crowns what was and might have been, cold, deep water, how water lapping on the stone, and water, gitchi, gaming, water, surface of the impossible, the shadow of the sound of seagull against closed eyelids, gulls' thin, insistent cry, pebbled shore of old-growth pines. How this world enters all of us in this summer wind, this nibin noidim, croker neya shinig miing, a point of land portage, a point of oneness that might have been, and yet may be, in Nawash, in harmony.
Maybe not everybody, but most people do know Sacagawea. And that is the name as it's pronounced in Hidatsa, which is her tribal identity and her native language. And it's had a rough history from the time it first entered American consciousness. She was the young Indian woman who walked across the Rockies with Lewis and Clark. Clark thought she was about 18 or 19, but she may have been younger still, possibly only 16. Clark had hired her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, in the winter of 1805. He found him in the Mandan villages on the upper Missouri. On the journey, Sacagawea carried her newborn son, 2 months old, when the expedition set out in April 1805. She was the youngest expeditioner and the only woman, the only Native American, and the only speaker of Shoshone. It is likely that Clark hired Charbonneau because his wife spoke Shoshone. It may be hard to believe, but one of the big jobs given to Lewis and Clark by President Thomas Jefferson was to negotiate an end to tribal warfare on the plains. And Sacagawea was going to help make that possible by allowing him to talk to the Shoshone. She did speak Shoshone, but she wasn't Shoshone. Pretty much everything we know about her as a person comes from the journals of the expedition. There were roughly 18 months on the road going out and back, and an immense body of words was recorded by 7 members of the expedition. One of the journals has been lost, so there are 6. And you can read them online at the University of Nebraska Library. It's all there by days, organized by date, with lots of footnotes and everything else. It's a vast body of material, and Sacagawea, later Sacagawea, is frequently mentioned. And she is always alive on the page. She always steals a scene. Wherever she happens to be mentioned or alive, she's right there in the forefront. They mostly called her the Indian woman, or our interpreter's wife, or Shabona's squaw. They could never quite get the pronunciation of Charbonneau's name right. It was Captain Clark who preserved her native name. He's the one who allows us to know really who she was. He knew what her name meant, and he decided on a way to spell it, and he learned how to pronounce it. 2 Hidatsa words, Sakaga, bird, and Wea, woman. Bird woman. Without Clark, I think it's highly likely we might only know that Shabona's squaw carried her newborn son across the Rocky Mountains. That was a gift to posterity and to her. Americans generally only know two Native American women. I'm sure everybody would know the other, Pocahontas. That's it. There are lots of other Native American women who have a moment's role on the stage in history, Sitting Bull's wives, for example, but nobody knows who they are. Just Sacagawea and Pocahontas. There are more statues in public places of Sacagawea than of any other American woman. I believe Eleanor Roosevelt is the second, and I expect that Rosa Parks is closely following and may even rise to position number one before it's over. Sacagawea's life as we'd known it ends in August of 1806 when Charbonneau and she left the expedition in the Mandan villages where Clark had hired them. After that, silence, with one or two glancing mentions in journals and diaries. The last contemporary record of her existence comes 6 years later, on December 20th, 1812. The chief clerk of Fort Manuel Liza on the Upper Missouri, a young fur trader named John Lustig, kept a journal. It was part of his job. And on that day, he wrote the following. This evening, the wife of Charbonneau, a Snake squaw, died of a putrid fever. She was a good and best woman in the fort, aged about 25 years. She left a fine infant girl. And that's all that anybody has successfully claimed to know about her life. She was born about 1787 and died in 1812. A short life with a sad ending. But I want you to keep in mind two things in thinking about her. When Captain Clark hired Charbonneau, he had two wives. Both spoke Shoshone, and Clark thought both were Snakes or Shoshones. Snake was an alternate name of the Shoshones. The second thing is to recognize that there is no evidence of any kind from any source which says which of Charbonneau's two Snake wives died at Fort Manuel Liza. But now we're given an alternative ending to Bird Woman's life. And this new story is rich and interesting. The ending is still sad, but it also has much to tell us if we are willing to listen. We are told that Sacagawea didn't die in 1812, but in 1869. She was 82 or 83, not in her mid-20s. This claim by itself is no small thing. Imagine how Texas would react if somebody offered solid evidence that Davy Crockett did not die at the Alamo in 1836, but lived as a prisoner in the Mexican jail for the next 20 years. That would be a radical revision of history, and it would have a lot to tell us. This dramatic expansion of Bird Woman's life, as we know it, comes from a source like no other that I know of. The Sacagawea Project Board of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. They are recognized by the federal government as the three affiliated tribes, and they have lived on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota since 1870, about 60 miles upriver from the villages where Lewis and Clark had hired Toussaint Charbonneau. The Project Board is the first group of Native Americans I know of to make a serious attempt to tell an important part of their own story. The 5 members of the Project Board are all relatives of Sacagawea. They're all roughly as old as I am. And from childhood, mainly from parents and grandparents, they heard all their lives a very different story. About 5 years ago, their patience ran out, with everybody getting it wrong. Those years they spent putting together a thorough and even-tempered book, giving us an immensely expanded account of Sacagawea's personal life, which helped us to see the era she lived through, the transformation of life on the northern plains. The Project Board's expanded account of the life is made in a new book called Our Story of Eagle Woman, Sacagawea. They got it wrong. You can buy it on Amazon. It was conceived and executed in standard scholarly fashion. It is chock-a-block with names and genealogies, documents and photographs, maps and drawings, but at the core of the book is the record of an extraordinary meeting which took place at Fort Berthold in 1923 between Army Captain A.B. Welch and a one-time Hidatsa Army scout named Bullseye. Take note, this story was first collected on Memorial Day 100 years ago, this coming month of May. Welch had come to deliver a Memorial Day speech to the Old Scout Society, and after he spoke, Bullseye introduced himself as the grandson of Sacagawea and said he wanted to correct some wrong impressions about his grandmother. Welch later said he sensed a good story and promptly arranged a formal meeting where Bullseye unfolded his story. With him were a number of tribal leaders who knew Bullseye, knew his story, and were there to back him up. And what he said, taken down by Captain Welch, was this: "My name is Bullseye. I am of the Hidatsa. I have seen 58 winters. I was a volunteer scout. I was with the soldiers at the mouth of the Yellowstone. I was with Custer at Fort Abraham Lincoln. I was young. My father's name was Lean Bull. He was Hidatsa. He was a brave man. My mother's name was Otter Woman. She was of the Hidatsa too. I was 4 years old when she was killed, sitting up against a wagon wheel. The name of my mother's mother was Sacagawea. She was my grandmother." Here, in his account, Welch added a note in parentheses. The 2 fingers to the mouth sign was given. The blood relationship sign. The father of my grandmother was Smoke Lodge. He was Hidatsa. He signed the Treaty of 1825. The mother of my grandmother was Otter Woman. She was Hidatsa too. My grandmother, Sacagawea, had a brother whose name was Cherry Necklace. My grandmother was married to a white man. When my grandmother was 17 years old, her father gave her to a white man. This white man was my grandfather. His name was Charbonish. There was a great deal more to Bullseye's story, and he continued to talk to Captain Welch for several more years. And Welch continued to write up extensive notes. What Bullseye was just quoted as saying, just think of that against the single sentence from John Luttig of her dying of a putrid fever in Fort Manuel, Eliza. I mean, one is a large claim about a life lived in a context, and the other is really as close to a footnote as a historical fact can come. The details are all new to history that are brought to us in this book. Captain Welch was an unusual man, passionately interested in Indians and an obsessive collector of information, which he wrote down and organized into a substantial archive, which went into an attic after he died and was forgotten until the most recent turn of the century. It's too soon to judge everything we are given in our story of Eagle Woman. One new fact usually connects to others, and something that looks small at first may grow, or the other way around. But I can tell you my overriding impression after 4 months of reading into the new material and a number of other books as well. It spreads a wide net. 60 years in the life of the 3 affiliated tribes begins to emerge. I was struck by the fact that Bullseye's mother, Otter Woman, had been conceived after the terrible smallpox epidemic of 1837, when half the Hidatsa tribe died in 6 months. Every Hidatsa woman who was able had children then. They were trying to save the tribe. Sacagawea had 3 late children in 3 years, all daughters. 30 years later, Sacagawea played a mother's role again. Bullseye spoke about this with Captain Welch a number of times. 2 things he remembered with clarity. Others he was told by friends and relatives, including his mother's sister, Cedar Woman, who cared for Bullseye as a child and lived with him until he was 30. He was there when his mother and grandmother died. It happened when Bullseye was 4 years old. He was with his mother and grandmother on a trip to a trading post near Fort Buford, up the Missouri from like a fishhook village. One night after dark, the travelers were attacked by Sioux Indians. Bullseye didn't say so, but there is good reason to believe these were Unkapapas from a war faction connected to Sitting Bull. Bullseye remembered 2 things about the attack. His mother leaning back at the wagon wheel, still able to speak, but bleeding to death, and his grandmother, Sacagawea, who led him away. We walked over the hills and prairie to the trader's store, Bullseye told Welch. I got well and lived. Sacagawea, my grandmother, died at the trader's place 7 days after that. What lingers about this story, easier to overlook at first, is the very fact of the attack. Prompted by what? For what purpose? The killing of Sacagawea and her daughter was simply an incident in the long war of the Sioux with just about everybody on the northern plains. You have to take notes and make a list to grasp how common these killings were, how brutal, how indiscriminate. Boys out looking for horses, families out gathering plums, women gardening, never felt safe, were often attacked and were often kidnapped or killed. Peace on the plains had been one of the goals set by Thomas Jefferson for Lewis and Clark. Toussaint Charbonneau was hired because his wife spoke Shoshone and might help negotiate this peace. That was in 1805, but 60 years later, the intertribal wars were more intense than ever, and they ended at last only after the tribes were confined to reservations. In the end, the hope of Thomas Jefferson was realized. He thought that with exploration and trade and endless talk, the American army could bring peace to the plains. And they did. Part of Sacagawea's story is that she and her daughter did not live to see it. But Bullseye did survive, and he left this story for the Sacagawea Project Board, and they have given it to us. Thank you.